Dead Space came out 18 years ago, and I avoided it for every one of them.
It became renowned as one of gaming's greatest horror experiences.
But frankly, I'm scared of my own shadow, let alone whatever was aboard the Ishimura. After enough pressure from friends and viewers, I finally stopped running from it and decided to play the remake completely blind. I expected Dead Space to terrify me. What I didn't expect was that fear to sustain once I understood how the game worked.
Horror normally has a breaking point. Eventually you start understanding the enemies, recognizing the tricks, and seeing the man behind the curtain.
Even The Conjuring, one of the most terrifying movie experiences I've ever had, eventually reaches that point. Dead Space never did. By the final chapter, I understood its combat, knew its monsters, and was familiar with the Ishimura, but I still didn't feel safe.
This sustained fear is something I've never experienced in any form of media. Ever.
And because of this, I've been fixated on exactly how this 18-year-old game accomplishes this. So let me take you along on my very first journey aboard the Ishimura and show you how Dead Space kept that fear alive until the very end. Dead Space immediately gave me two things that I love in video games: immersion and exploration.
The problem was that in a horror game, both of those worked against me.
The first thing that stood out was its near invisible UI.
Dead Space is played in third person, but almost everything I need to know is built directly onto Isaac and his equipment.
His health is displayed along his spine, his stasis energy sits beside it, and his ammunition is projected above whichever weapon he is holding. Instead of surrounding the screen with health bars and ability icons, Dead Space uses Isaac himself as the interface. This wasn't some modern improvement made by the remake either. The original game was already doing it in 2008, and the remake preserves that idea while making almost every other interaction feel like part of the ship. Isaac's inventory, map, and communications appear as holographic projections in front of him, while stores, workbenches, and save stations are physical terminals aboard the Ishimura. Opening the inventory doesn't pause the game or properly remove you from danger. Outside of the settings menu, Dead Space rarely lets you step away from its world.
This seamless presentation impressed me immediately, but this also meant that there was little separating me from whatever was going to happen.
As Isaac and the rest of the repair crew arrive aboard the Ishimura, I was already conflicted. I was ecstatic that a game could present itself this well, but I knew that exact design was about to work against me. It didn't take long. What begins as a routine repair mission collapses within minutes. The ship enters quarantine, one of our crew members is skewered, and I'm separated from everyone before being chased toward an elevator by some sort of creature. Being chased has always freaked me out, so being introduced to the monsters by placing one right behind me wasn't appreciated. Isaac also moves like what he is, an engineer wearing a heavy industrial suit. He isn't an acrobat who can jump around enemies or easily escape after getting surrounded. There's plenty to discuss about fighting these creatures, especially how long it took me to stop aiming for their heads, but that first attack was enough to establish what I had gotten myself into.
This was where the lack of a traditional interface became more than just impressive game design.
I have this physical response to horror movies that I call the blocking technique. I don't stop watching, but I put something between me and the screen, whether that's a downturned hat or a really high pillow. It reinforces that I'm watching a movie and creates a little distance between me and whatever is happening. I have never been scared in real life and thought by covering my eyes that would solve the problem, but my brain constantly does that with horror movies. Normal UI clutter can create a similar distance in games by reminding me that I'm controlling something on a screen.
Dead Space takes almost all of that away.
Once the monsters disappeared, the lack of distance became even worse. The Ishimura is in complete disarray, its power is failing, its crew is missing,
and nearly every room looks like something terrible has already happened there.
That leaves countless dark corridors, empty rooms, and long gondola rides where nothing is visibly attacking you. But the game gives you many reasons to believe that something might.
This is also where my love of exploration started working against me.
I've read nearly 90 books since last August, more than half of them science fiction. And I've loved the Alien films for most of my life. Series like The Expanse, Bobiverse, Children of Time, The Murderbot Diaries made me love science fiction worlds where ships, machinery, and infrastructure feel like parts of something much larger. Alien gave me that same fascination with deteriorating industrial spaces I would never willingly enter myself.
The Ishimura let me explore one.
medical, engineering, hydroponics, and the crew quarters all feel like places people actually lived and worked before everything fell apart. The remake expands that feeling by turning the Ishimura into one large interconnected ship.
As more of the tram system opens, you can return to some of those earlier docks,
Unlock rooms with higher security clearances, and investigate areas that have nothing to do with the immediate objective. I wanted to search all of it, even though every additional room gave the game another opportunity to attack me.
I desperately wanted to leave the Ishimura, but I couldn't stop exploring it.
Even the act of repairing the ship could force that conflict. Several circuit breakers made me choose which systems receive power, and sometimes continuing meant shutting off the lights.
Whenever I saw that option, I genuinely had to stop and take a breath. If it said lights, man, I did not want to touch it.
Later in the game, sometimes I kept those lights running at the expense of something more useful, because walking through those corridors blind felt like the worst possible choice. The save stations also became finish lines I would sprint toward.
Although that became far more important when the game started draining my health, ammunition, and, well, my sanity.
Eventually, seeing the Ishimura itself became less important than hearing it. Dead Space made listening to the ship necessary for survival.
And the sound design became one of the main reasons that I never felt safe aboard it. The thing about Dead Space was I couldn't dampen the horror by lowering the volume. Hearing is integral to surviving, but it also amplified everything that made this game terrifying. A horror movie without sound just doesn't work.
The Quiet Place takes this concept to the extreme. Shamefully, I'll sometimes mute a scary movie and fast forward through the worst parts just to get a diluted version of the experience. With BioShock, I developed a one headphone off technique whenever things became too tense.
That was legitimately impossible with Dead Space.
Isaac's limited maneuverability, the close camera, and the Ishimura's failing lights meant I would often hear a monster before I could see it. Keeping the volume low could mean missing where something entered the room, losing health before I could react, or allowing myself to get surrounded.
The game developers knew this and actively started fucking with my expectations.
During the opening chapters, I thought I had figured out how enemies entered different areas.
Motherfucker.
The Ishimura is covered in ventilation shafts that the Necromorphs use to move around the ship. I started breaking the vent covers before anything arrived because I thought I had gamed the system. If the obvious entrance was already destroyed, maybe I could see the attack coming or somehow prevent it entirely.
I didn't game anything. Breaking the cover didn't stop the monster from entering through the vent. If anything, I was removing the loud crash that would have warned me that something was entering the room. These demonic developers took this one visual pattern that I thought I understood and made listening even more important. Then came the fake-outs.
I would hear something scurrying above me or moving through the walls, only for nothing to enter the room. Before long, I was stopping every few steps to check behind me. Most of the time, nothing was there, which somehow didn't help. The sound had already forced me to turn around and give an empty hallway my full attention. Sometimes a monster really was passing through the ship without noticing me.
Other times a fan would start rattling for no other reason than the Ishimura was just falling apart. The remake has this thing called the Intensity Director that's capable of changing sound, lighting, fog, steam, encounters as you move through the ship, particularly when revisiting areas.
A vent might break open and release a monster one time, break without even coming through another time, or give me none of those warnings I expected.
I could learn this pattern, but I could never trust the result.
Isaac himself became part of the sound design. I could regularly hear him breathing inside his suit, with his breath and heart rate changing as he became exhausted, injured, or panicked.
Dr. Mercer, he's locked down medical to experience.
Even his dialogue could sound more strained depending on his physical condition.
The remake has a system called Alive that's controlling these reactions, and it made Isaac's fear almost impossible to separate from my own. His breathing would reinforce my panic, especially if it was the only familiar noise inside of a dark room.
It made Isaac feel less like a character I was controlling and more like an actual vessel I was part of. The Ishimura never sounded empty either. Machinery groaned, metal shifted, fans struggled, and something always seemed to be moving just outside the room. Whenever the score rose, it sounded like the music that plays immediately before someone gets slaughtered in a horror movie.
The worst part in reality was when it stopped. I never knew if the silence meant that I was safe or if it was just clearing space for another big scare. Then there was the whispering.
It sounded like the effect used when someone in a movie discovers a group of elders performing dark magic inside a forgotten temple.
Except Dead Space used it constantly. I had no explanation for why Isaac was hearing this on my blind playthrough, so I just made the assumption that the ship itself was getting inside my own head.
The only real relief came during the zero atmosphere sections. Most of the ship's noise disappeared, leaving Isaac's breathing and the suit warning as our only company. There were still necromorphs terrifyingly launching themselves through the air at me, but losing that constant wall of noise was a genuine break for my nerves.
Dead Space does plenty to sustain its horror, but its sound design might be its greatest weapon.
It forced me to interact with every noise because any of them could communicate something necessary for survival.
Meaning that if every noise could be important, then none of them can be ignored.
That constant attention is the main reason I finished every chapter so tense that I needed to stand up and walk around my apartment.
Holy.
Listening might have told me where the next monster was going to come from, but that didn't mean that I had enough health or ammunition to survive when it arrived. And that made every new room and unexplored area above the Ishimura a gamble. At this point, fear itself was changing how I played the game. Every unopened door aboard the Ishimura presented a wager.
It might contain the ammunition or health I desperately needed, but reaching it could cost more than I found.
Normally, I love exploring every new area that a game presents to me. Dead Space made me calculate the potential cost of entering every new room, and even the act of backtracking.
The fear wasn't limited to what might be waiting inside. I also had to consider what going inside might take from me. Dead Space gives you limited inventory space that eventually needs to hold several weapons, ammunition, stasis packs, and whatever health you can find.
This created many moments where I had to decide between another med pack or ammunition for a gun that I actually used.
Now, factor in my poor aim, and I was burning through more resources than the average person. I could enter an optional room looking for supplies, have 3 necromorphs spawn, and waste several shots while taking damage.
My reward might be 1 small med pack, ammunition for a gun that I absolutely despise, or credits that are a fraction of the cost of everything that I used to get into this room. The opposite could also happen and make the detour worthwhile, but I could never know that until I opened that door.
Even a fight I survived could feel like a loss if it left me less prepared for the next one. Combat itself was terrifying because most necromorphs immediately lunged towards me, turning every encounter into an attempt to immobilize them before I was surrounded. My instinct for almost every other game was to aim for the head. Dead Space quickly teaches you that this is the wrong approach.
These creatures could take an incredible amount of punishment, so removing their limbs was the easiest way to slow them down and control the room.
The remake makes every shot horrifyingly visible as their bodies are stripped apart until a limb finally comes off. Isaac isn't some acrobat either, he is an everyday man,
although admittedly one with a stasis module and plenty of engineering expertise.
He can't backward somersault into a dolphin dive whenever something gets close, so positioning and aim become incredibly important.
I never particularly got good at this either.
The tool I conserved far more than I should have was stasis. It could slow enemies long enough for me to kneecap them, reposition, or stop an entire group from collapsing on me. Because it had limited charges and required a stasis pack or recharge station to replenish, I kept saving it for some imaginary future encounter that might be worse. I repeatedly ignored the tool that could save me because I was afraid of not having it later.
If I survived the fight, the game presented one more surprise.
Getting loot from a dead necromorph usually required walking over and stomping its body into pulp.
I think this mechanic is super cool now, but you need to understand that I'm playing Dead Space blind for the first time with zero expectations. The amount of gore involved with simply getting my loot was a hill that I would slowly get over.
This is why the Ripper became my favorite weapon. It easily dismembered enemies, required very little aim, and often cut them apart enough that the extra smashing was unnecessary. Its secondary attack launched the spinning blade across the room, and watching it land several hits became more satisfying every time.
Every fight was a desperate struggle for loot, as I needed to be better prepared for whatever came next.
This made the store its own source of anxiety. I could justify buying health, ammunition, or a power node, but 9 times out of 10, those new resources would disappear as soon as I entered the next room. The same pressure completely changed how I treated saving. The remake autosaves at major checkpoints, but I rarely knew when the last one had triggered. The physical save stations became the closest thing I had to safety.
I became so paranoid about losing progress that that I would hit the same save station 2 or 3 times just to make sure.
Dying without a recent save wasn't only frustrating because I had lost time.
It meant repeating the same encounters and forcing myself through those same scares again.
Save stations became beacons I would rush toward after surviving something difficult. When that beautiful chapter-ending graphic finally appeared, I knew I could breathe again, find the nearest station, stop recording, and stare at a wall until I was ready to start the whole laundry list of emotions over again.
After several chapters though, I was getting better.
I understood the combat, knew which weapons worked for me, and was beginning to recognize how the game constructed its encounters.
This should have been where the fear started beginning to fade, but everything I learned gave Dead Space something new to use against me. By chapter 6, midway through Dead Space, I noticed a pretty serious problem. I understood the game much better now, but I wasn't any less afraid of it.
I knew to cut off limbs, watch the vents, listen behind me, conserve my resources, and never trust a body lying conveniently in the middle of a room. One type of necromorph could infect intact human corpses and turn them into new enemies, so I started stomping every body I found before the game could try any funny shit.
I stomped a lot of innocent bodies.
The game was also giving me tools that I was too rattled to use properly. Explosive canisters, severed blades, and pointed pieces of the environment could all be launched with kinesis. Some could blow apart a group or pin a necromorph directly to the wall.
I understood that on paper, but the moment anything charged me, I kinda just shot anything that still had ammo. Even useful knowledge could disappear when panic started. That is what Dead Space kept doing. Anytime I recognized a new pattern, that was a new threat that I would have to now keep looking out for.
It completely changed the way I explored. I usually scour maps for every side quest, rare item, and piece of lore I can find. In Dead Space, the locator line on the floor became my lifeline. I followed it religiously and only opened the map at crossroads to check which nearby room contained loot. Every locked door requiring higher security clearance created dread because I knew the game was giving me a reason to return later. At one point, I found a DNA scanner and spent nearly 10 minutes feeding random body parts into it, convinced one of them would work.
Eventually, I accepted that the correct sample didn't exist yet and that I would probably have to come back. The one side mission that I did follow actually involved that scanner and the hunter's tissue.
It added more than 30 minutes of backtracking through areas I'd already cleared, except they weren't really cleared anymore. New enemies appeared from different entrances, familiar corridors changed, and the intensity director made my knowledge of the Ishimura feel unreliable. I enjoyed learning what had been done to the hunter, but the trip confirmed that exploring beyond the main route meant volunteering for more horror.
The hunter was one of the biggest examples of how Dead Space was using its own rules against me.
Until chapter 5, spraying bullets in the general direction of a necromorph worked eventually.
It wasn't efficient or even dignified, but most things died.
Then, these diabolical designers introduced a creature with Deadpool's healing factor. The hunter regenerated every limb I removed.
So my normal objective of killing the necromorphs no longer existed.
And ammunition spent trying to finish it permanently was ultimately wasted. This thing was the exact reason I kept hoarding stasis, even though it was practically a free win in normal fights. My lack of skill left me with one reliable strategy: stasis and book it.
Anytime the hunter appeared, any intentions of looting or looking for any lore completely disappeared.
My heart rate spiked, and I stumbled past everything as quickly as Isaac's industrial suit would allow.
This was my recurring childhood nightmare of being chased by raptors, except they were given crack and this regeneration power.
Escaping the encounter didn't even mean it was gone. It was still somewhere aboard the ship, and I knew it would eventually return. I didn't feel any permanent relief until chapter 10 when I lured it behind a shuttle and atomized it with the engines.
The hunter was the most extreme version of this problem, but the rest of the game just kept on finding new ways to sustain it.
New necromorphs changed how I prioritized targets. Zero gravity removed the comfort of knowing which direction an attack would come from. Returning to a familiar area didn't guarantee a familiar encounter. Even when I recognized an obvious combat arena or suspicious vent, the attack would come from somewhere else, or never happen at all, leaving me waiting for it.
By the end, I knew basically all of Dead Space's tricks. It's just I could never know which one it was going to use next. Once I finally escaped the Ishimura, I was genuinely surprised how much Dead Space stayed with me after I finished playing it.
I would finish a recording session, walk around my apartment for a while, and then spend the next few hours thinking about everything the game had just put me through.
Friends and family would ask about my playthrough of Dead Space. In response, they would receive a tirade about its sound design, its immersion, its resource management, and all the brilliant reasons that made me miserable.
I didn't love everything. The story never grabbed me the way BioShock did, and by chapter 5, I had already called the general direction of its twist. The boss fights were probably the weakest part as well, especially when I lacked ammunition for the weapon they clearly wanted me to use.
Those problems just weren't what I was thinking about when I put the controller down.
The Ishimura was exactly the type of setting I wanted to explore. I spent the past year buried in science fiction and most of my life loving Alien.
So a dying industrial ship that was overrun by something that I didn't understand was kind of made for me.
I wanted to search every room, learn what happened to the crew, and see how the whole ship fit together. But at the same time, I also wanted to reach the next save station as quickly as possible so I could stop playing and calm the fuck down. That conflict carried me through the entire game.
I avoided Dead Space for 18 years because I thought its horror was too much for me. And after finally finishing it, I can confirm it absolutely was.
By the final chapter, I knew how to fight its monsters, read its rooms, and recognize most of its tricks. I just never trusted what would happen after I opened the next door.
It remained terrifying because learning how it worked never meant I was safe. That fear held until the very end, and after avoiding Dead Space for 18 years, I finally understand its reputation. Thanks for watching. A like or subscribe goes a long way if you liked my exploration of Dead Space.
Less than 1% of you are actually subscribed, so join the 1%. If you want to see a completely different experience with another game I entered blind, check out my recent BioShock video.
And check back for my next video on Cyberpunk 2077.
This was a community poll vote winner, but I'm happy as this was one of my most anticipated games of all time. A game that became one of gaming's largest launch failures,
And somehow one that I've always loved but never actually beat. Check the community tab if you want to vote for future games, and until next time, my name is Easy Break. Toodaloo.